All right, well, I think we got this thing worked out. Um, I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of a devotional today. This is Pastor Dave of Covenant Reformed Baptist Church, but to some of you, I'm just Dave. I'm possibly Uncle Dave. That's what I've gone by with my blog post. And one of my habits in my devotional life is I write in a devotional ledger, and lately I'm working my way through the book of Ephesians and also through the book of Psalms on Friday and Saturday mornings. And I'm currently in Psalm 61. And I was so struck by the blessing of what I was reading and what I was thinking about as I went through Psalm 61. I ended up kind of writing a small sermon or a devotional, and I thought I would share it with you. Psalm 61 goes like this. It says, "Hear my cry, O God." This is a psalm of David. "Hear my cry, O God, attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth I will cry to you. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I." That's what it says. And as I was going on, I have three questions that came to me. Let me read two more verses, so we'll read all of the first four verses of Psalm 61. It's like this. It says, "For you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy. I will abide in your tabernacle forever. I will trust in the shelter of your wings." That's Psalm 61, a psalm of David. So it's interesting because today I was working on verses 3 and 4, the verses I just finished reading. I usually do one or two verses each Friday, Saturday, and I just kind of study them. Sometimes I just devotionally meditate upon them, which doesn't mean emptying my brain. You're really just thinking about this. And kind of that's what I was doing. "For you have been a shelter for me." And of course, that's a word that's been popular in the last few weeks, and it struck me. Here it is. That's the actual word right there in Scripture. And what is a shelter? It's one of our most basic needs. It's tied closely to food and clothing, right? It's something we retreat to when we're in trouble. Just looking at the dictionary, some simple definitions. We think of a bomb shelter, right? A place that affords protection. Possibly shelter in respect of homeless people. They need shelter, right? That's what our home is. It's shelter. I've got a friend, Fred. He works at an animal shelter, right? Takes care of animals. Also, it could be that if you use the word as a verb, it's the act of providing shelter or a place to shelter in. And of course, we've all heard of a tax shelter, right? A place to protect our money from Uncle Sam. There's some common uses of the word shelter, and here we're told in these days, that we're supposed to shelter in place. And what does that mean? Well, it means refuge. Take refuge. There's an enemy out there, right? It means protection. Protect yourself. But look at this scripture here and answer the question, what is the threat that David is sheltering from? It says here, "Hear my cry, O God, attend to my prayer." So he's praying, and he's praying to God. And he says, "From the end of the earth I will cry to you." Meaning wherever he's at, he's calling unto God. "When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. For you have been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy." So we're really not told specifically what the threat David is sheltering himself from. It could be from King Saul, who was always coming after David. Could have been one of Israel's enemies. It might even have been his son Absalom, who tried to wrest the kingdom from him. Okay, whatever the threat was, we know that it led to David's heart being overwhelmed. That's what it says in verse 2, right? The Hebrew word for overwhelmed here references weakness. Weakness. Think about that. I'm going to set this down so I don't have to hold it. Weakness. You know, we today feel like we are in a sense of unsettledness. Things are not stable, right? We feel unprepared against a threat that we can't see. We feel there's no place to run. Yet David says there is. In verse 2 he says, "Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." Okay? So my second question for the day is, how is God a shelter? Well, in verse 3 we see that God himself is the shelter to David, actually in a very simple way. Everyone here who's listening or watching or whatever, they might understand this. Like a child who's been frightened, he runs to his mother's knees, or he runs into the arms of his father. David is using the same imagery. God is a strong tower. And that word tower is nothing special, but we don't use it in common usage today the way they did then. It was tied to walls, walled cities, right? And there would be towers and battlements. Towers were used for lookouts. And sometimes I think we forget the purpose of a tower. Towers were a defensive mechanism. They provided troop shelter when the battle went south. They provided early warning that an enemy was coming. David is using this picture, and he says that God is his strong tower against the enemy, whoever the enemy is. Then he says he will abide in God's tabernacle or in his tent. And this word abide is really interesting. The base meaning is to dwell as an alien and a dependent. And a lot of us are feeling kind of dependent right now. Some of us have lost jobs. We've had the foundations of our house pulled out all around us. I know I haven't felt as comfortable with things like as have gone on, and I haven't lost my job. My wife, she's lost hers, but I know there are people out there that have lost their entire income. That can be very, very heavy. But David's answer, in his difficulty and struggle, David's answer was to lean into the Lord and depend upon him. He says he will trust in the shelter of God's wings. I want to read a verse for you from Matthew, a verse that Jesus was saying, and he was expressing a lament over Jerusalem in that they had not taken their trust in the Messiah. They were rejecting Christ. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to you. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." Now, Jesus is using a very similar image to what David says. David says, "I will trust in the shelter of your wings." And Jesus is referencing almost the other side of it. Jesus wants to be the protection of his children. But what does he say? He says, "But you were not willing." So let me give you the final question that I'd like to ask. Who is the Christian's shelter? And I think some of you are probably saying, I know. If a shelter can be more than a place, but it can be a person, and I think we've established that, who is our shelter? And of course the answer is Jesus. It's just the first grade Sunday school answer, right? Always say Jesus, you'll be right. Jesus himself is our shelter. No other person so perfectly fits this definition as our Lord. He protects us, he provides us, and covers us in our deepest and our greatest crises. And we're living in a time of crisis. Threats that we cannot see are worse than threats we can see, right? At least to some extent. However, the threats that we can't see, they might be a blessing in disguise. See, if we see a threat, we take our own stock and we try to do things ourselves to protect ourselves, and that's not wrong. But there is a sense that I want to leave you with, where ultimately your hope isn't in the ability that you have to protect yourself. It's really only in Christ. It's always good to trust the living God. Christ the Son is our best hope that we have. And while there is a virus out there that we need to shelter from, shelter in place, right? Our greatest need is not medicinal, but it's hamartiological, if I can say that word. That's a big long word that basically says our greatest need is salvation from our sins. Hebrews 9:27 tells us, and it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment. And death is inescapable, whether by a virus or by heart disease, but the judgment is the thing that we seek shelter from. We're not seeking shelter from death. You can't escape death, right? We're all going to die. All we have to do is drive down the road. We can see the graveyards. They're filled with people. And you're going to be in there one day too. And so will I. Death's inescapable. But judgment, my friend, we might find escape from. I've got the good news here. Jesus Christ came to save sinners like you and me from the judgment. And make no mistake, sin is a far greater enemy than any virus that's out there. And if you already know the Lord, these are all just wonderful words that probably are giving you a great sense of comfort. And that's why I'm bringing this out. But you might come down with the fever. You might die, but Christ is your rock. He's the thing that you're clinging to in the midst of this crisis. He's the rock that is higher than I, as verse 2 says. When Moses struck the rock, springs of water came out. It was a type of salvation to the Israelites. The antitype was Christ himself. And we see that in that Moses was striking the rock, it was pointing to Christ's death on the cross to take our sins' penalty. Let me read a verse from John chapter 4 when Jesus was speaking to the Samaritan woman. Jesus answered and said to her, this is John 4:13 and 14, "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life." Moses struck the rock and water came out. And Jesus says, "I have living water for you." In Psalm 61 verse 4, we read that David is trusting in the shelter of your wings. He's praying to God. Now, I just urge you to not let this present crisis leave you fearful or afraid. My prayer is that you lean into the storm, that you trust the rock that is higher than we are. Trust in the shadow of his wings. Some other verses you might want to look at. Read Psalm 94. You could read Isaiah 25, verse 4. You could read Isaiah 32, verse 2. When I am afraid, I will trust in you, the scripture says, right? David says, "For you have been a shelter to me." And that's not to say that he's only been a shelter, but he will continue to be the shelter. I will abide in your tabernacle forever. He's going to lean into this. He's going to become dependent on God. And that's not bad. If there's someone that you need to be dependent on, wouldn't it be God? The one who can make the provisions that you need? Be encouraged, brothers and sisters. God is still on the throne, and He's got His wings out there to cover you. Blessings. Bye-bye.